Well, yesterday at the end of our session, we had gotten to a point where we had talked about the kind of things that one should take into mind as one confronts end-of-life issues and decisions. And then we had started to apply those principles to the broad areas of euthanasia that we had set forth. And we had talked about death selection. That one was pretty easy. Mercy killing, a little more complicated, but not impossible from a pro-life ethic. And we had just come to death with dignity cases, and I suggested to you that these are the most difficult, and I thought that perhaps one of the better ways to handle this is to take an example of a real case and share it with you and see what you think. So I am going to read not the whole thing, but a little bit from an essay. This appeared in March 1988 in the journal Second Opinion, and that was volume 7. The author is Harry A. Cole, C-O-L-E, and the topic or the title of the essay is Deciding on a Time to Die. Now, what I'm going to do is read you some of this that describes the situation, and then stop and ask you, what you think you would do, or as you hear what happened in this situation, how would you evaluate that? But not only do we want to ask what you would advise, what you would have done, but even more so, well, on what grounds? What's the line of defense for whatever course of action you would suggest? So, here goes. The article, the essay begins as follows. On the morning of March 29, 1986, the day before Easter, my wife, Jacqueline, suffered a sudden and massive stroke. Within minutes, she lapsed into a coma and was rushed to the nearest hospital, where I was told that she would almost certainly die within a few hours. Although Jackie did survive the day and several days thereafter, I was informed by her physician that she would never regain consciousness, and if she were to survive, it would be in a persistent vegetative state. Okay, let's imagine that this happened to a family member of yours, or perhaps someone in one of your churches, and you got that word from the doctors. What do you think you would do? As the essay goes on, it becomes clear that they put her on life support apparatus that was necessary for her to continue at all. But what do you think you would do in a situation like this? Do you think you would say, well, let's remove the machinery and let her die? Let's continue the machinery? Just what would you do, and why would you advise such a course of action? Let me open it to you. What do you think? Yes.
The initial thing that popped into my head was, look, that's my wife. I'm going to do everything that I can to give her the possibility to revive her life, regardless of how minimal the chances might seem. At least give her that chance.
Okay, good. I think many of us would respond that way. We would say, as has been mentioned, if that's my wife, I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that she survives. But while I think we all would be inclined in that direction, obviously there would be a great deal of shock that we were undergoing at that point. But she has this stroke, she lapses into a coma, and she's put on life support system, and the doctor says that she's never again going to regain consciousness, and if she does survive, it's probably going to be in a persistent vegetative state. Yes.
Call over my Christian brother, who I've got in touch with before, and I'd ask him to explain to me what's going on, what the ins and outs are, and maybe have a meeting with the physician in the hospital, and just because a stroke is a stroke, it's a stroke, but what's happened and for anything else.
Okay. So you would do then what initially? You'd try to schedule a meeting with the husband to do what? To find.
With another Christian doctor.
Okay.
Because I mean, all of us, I'm sure, have experienced people who've had strokes, and they're just so varied in nature, and I try and get a grip on what is happening. What does it mean she's going to be in a permanent
Okay.
state?
Thinking back on what we said about decision-making procedure for ethical issues, we'd first of all want to identify what our ethical theory is, and if we hold some biblically based kind of ethic, we're going to be non-consequentialists, and that means that you would do what with what the doctor says when he says it's dubious that she's going to regain consciousness, and if she does survive, it will be in a persistent vegetative state. Now, hearing that, should that move you if you are a non-consequentialist? I mean, is that going to be the determining factor for you? No, it shouldn't be. Well, then, what sorts of things should be the determining factor if we're non-consequentialist? Let me just go back for a moment. We would want to, as our brother has mentioned, find out as much as we could about her condition and the outlook for the future. In the essay, he doesn't include a whole lot of other details about what the doctor says, but he does give us something of the outlook. And I think if you were not sure that the doctor who was involved was pro-life, or even if you thought he was pro-life, it might be a good thing to get a second opinion, just to be as clear as you possibly could about the medical and physical condition of this woman. But let's say then that you do that, you get a second opinion, you're working with pro-life doctors all around, and they still say the same thing that's been said here. What do you think you would do, hearing that she's not going to regain consciousness, and if she even survives, we're expecting her to be in a persistent vegetative state? Do you think at that point it would be appropriate to remove the technology? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
First, I would take a look at, try and slow the situation down, and really wrap my arms around it. Is she responding to stimuli of any type? Is she technically dead? And sanctity of life issue. And then start going through, like you laid out in the book here, the Harvard medical rules.
Okay, very, very good. I think this is very, very helpful. One of the things that would be good to do, given the gravity of the situation and the severity of the diagnosis and prognosis, I think any of us, whether it was our wife or our parishioner, would probably be inclined to say, well, you know, with what you're saying, doctor, does she meet the criteria for physical death? If she's unconscious and you talk with her, there's probably not going to be any response whatsoever. It's not clear whether there would be any reflex reaction, if you could somehow or other test that. Um, and when it comes to fixed dilated pupils, things of that sort, well, it might be too difficult to tell at that point, but maybe, maybe not. What is probably going to be key in a situation like this, where she is unconscious, has had this major event, is to have a brainwave test done to see if there's any evidence of brain activity. Now, my understanding is that someone who's had this happen would not necessarily show nothing on an electroencephalogram. But yes, I think this would be a good thing to do, to ask yourself, is this person physically dead? And if the conclusion is no, she's not, but it looks like while she is alive, here's the outcome, here's the prognosis for the future, and it's not very rosy. So if the doctors and the hospital, the nurses, whatever, begin to pressure you on, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to continue life support, or do you want to remove life support, or just what? What do you think you would say, and why would you think what you're going to say is the appropriate thing to say? What would you think? Yes.
Having established that she's not clinically dead, I will opt to have her with the life support and pray and seek the will of God, whether take it or not.
Okay.
Just try.
Okay. So the suggestion here is that since she doesn't meet the requirements for being physically dead, at this point, one would say, well, let's wait and see, and let's pray that the Lord will make it clear. If he wants to take her, he has the right to do that. If he wants her to come out of the coma, surely that is within his power and his will to do or not to do. What kind of ethical considerations and any other considerations would enter into that sort of decision?
Life preservation.
Okay, right. It's not acceptable, morally permissible to take innocent life. And by having had this stroke, she has not committed any sin or any crime that would warrant ending her life because of something that is punishable by death. And it seems, I think I would want to find out from the doctors whether they think if the technology was removed, could she continue in the state that she is, or would she surely die? Now, the reason that I say this is that there's a very, very famous case. Many of you probably will recognize the name, Karen Ann Quinlan. She was a relatively young woman in her 20s, I think it was, and somewhat unexpectedly had a major incident. I think it was cardiac arrest. But whether it was that or a stroke, she wound up being in a coma, was hooked up to a respirator, and time went by and there was no change. Nothing got better, nothing got worse. And this went on for about 10 years. And finally, after the 10 years, the family asked for permission to remove the respirator. They were able to get permission. They removed the respirator. We talked about this yesterday. And lo and behold, she didn't stop breathing. Well, at the time in history when this occurred, nobody had established under the U.S. Constitution any sort of right to die. So for someone to take active means to put her to death in that situation would have been something that could have been prosecuted as a crime. So they basically left her. They continued to feed her and give her antibiotics and whatnot. And eventually, after a period of time, she did die. But realizing that there are cases like that, I would want to ask the doctors, in this case, what do you think would happen if the life support that you have used on my wife were to be removed? Would she certainly die, or would she likely continue to live? Part of the reason you want to know that is that you want to find out, I think it could be useful to know, whether her own body and its organs are keeping her alive and able to keep her alive, or whether it's really just this machine that's doing it. Now, if it's just the machine, the temptation to remove the machinery is going to be probably great, and even greater because the doctors and nurses and hospital may put extra pressure on you to remove it, but that doesn't mean that it would be necessarily morally acceptable to do so. The rule that would apply here still is it's not morally acceptable to take innocent life. And if you thought, well, she's only able to stay alive as a result of the machinery, that means that it would be okay to kill her. It seems to me that one would be hard-pressed on a non-consequentialist theory of ethics to point to an ethical rule that would allow that. It seems that if you come to that kind of conclusion, that would stem more from a consequentialist approach where you say, well, what are the chances that she's going to survive and recover fairly rapidly? And if so, then yeah, go ahead and use the machinery because that will aid her. If, on the other hand, it's only going to postpone dying and there will be no use to her of that, we're going to watch her in this condition. If the bills are going to mount, well, all of those things could tempt you to pull the plug, so to speak, but those are consequentialist concerns. And if we are non-consequentialists, we shouldn't be making our decisions on those sorts of grounds. Okay, well, it seems to me, yes, please.
See that the bills continue to mount.
Yeah.
So the capacity of the person making the decision is limited by a small purse. That's an issue.
Yes. Well, that is surely true. I don't think you would find, however, that a hospital would say, oh, you don't have insurance or you don't have your own funds, we're going to kick you out on the street. Normally, what the medical profession will do is to say, well, you know, here's the care that needs to be given, and let's give the care and we'll worry about how to get this paid off later. But that sort of consideration is, again, a consequentialist concern. That doesn't mean that it's unimportant and that you shouldn't think about it at all. I mean, if you're going to fully understand the situation you're dealing with, you need to understand those aspects of it as well. And, you know, if it turns out that there is another facility, medical facility, where you could get the same care at less expense and the outcome is likely to be the same thing, well, then that might factor into a decision to maybe switch facilities, but that shouldn't factor into a decision of whether to take her life or not take her life, at least if one is a non-consequentialist using a biblically based ethic. Yes.
I have this, as we're thinking through this question about you're a non-consequentialist when it comes to the economic factors, right? Hypothetically, let's say there's a treatment, it costs $1 million, and the possibility of extending life is not, incredibly higher than the lower cost treatment. As a non-consequentialist, you have a moral obligation to say, you know what, money's no object, so I'm going to go for this $1 million treatment because I think it has a higher percentage? Or can you morally and acceptably say, I just can't afford that, economically I can't afford that, so I'm going to have to go with the lesser treatment?
Well, great question. Let me repeat so that we're sure that everyone has heard, including those who are listening in over the internet. The question is, when it comes to financial issues, even if one is a non-consequentialist, suppose they say at some point in caring for this person, there is another kind of treatment. It costs about $1 million, and it might help a little bit, but the chances of it being much more of a help than what you're already doing are fairly slim. Because you are pro-life, are you morally required to go for the other treatment that turns out to be more expensive, quite a bit more expensive? Or if you rejected it, would you be violating any ethical principles of your ethical theory? In response, I would say, if your reason for rejecting that other treatment is totally the cost, and you think that the cost determines the morality of whatever you do, then I think you're making the decision as a as a consequentialist, which would be inconsistent with your non-consequentialist ethic, especially one based on Scripture. It seems to me that the ethical rule that is significant here, the important one, is we have a duty not to take a life. It doesn't appear that either of these courses of treatment would take her life, but the flip side of that is that we do have a duty to preserve life when it's possible to do so. So if I have that duty, then I want to, if I'm told about another medical procedure, the cost should not be the deciding factor for a non-consequentialist, but the question of whether this would do any good. Will this really preserve life? Will it heal? That should be paramount. And if the doctors say, well, this is relatively new, it's experimental, and the success rate with it is fairly low, and you've got maybe only a slightly greater chance of recovery if you use this as opposed to the course of treatment we're using, well, then I think in a case like that, you're not morally duty-bound to pursue that. Not because of the cost, but because it doesn't really seem as though this other treatment is going to be is going to work any better than the one that you've got. I can preserve her life just as well with the course of treatment that I'm using as I would if I were to try this other thing. And since the chances of preserving her life are roughly the same, then I think it's at that point you can say, well, okay, now maybe I should think about the finances of the situation. What is the point, practically speaking, of spending all the extra money, and the likelihood that it will do anything different is relatively small. So, yeah, I don't think that being pro-life means you have to engage in every available, every possible treatment, every surgery, every medication, especially if the doctor says the success rate is minimal. If it's a surgical procedure, you might even die in the midst of the operation. I don't think you have to go through with this. If you do choose to use this new procedure, whatever it might be, I think you are permitted to do so. I don't think you are required to do so. Well, good question. Well, in talking about this test case, if we can come back to that, yes?
Going off the same lines, if you have a situation where a family's ability to, or a man or a woman's ability to provide for their children is being decreased, like you're putting someone in an economic hardship trying to preserve this life. Again, it's hard not to think consequentially in those situations. How do you approach that?
The question, and I will answer this, and these are great questions. But after I answer this one, let's come back to the test case, or we're not going to make the kind of progress we need today. The question is, if in fact there is a certain cost that whatever the treatment is pretty extensive, and because the family has to pay a substantial amount, that is making it more difficult for them to take care of the needs of the other members of the family. And as a non-consequentialist, could you ever take that into consideration and maybe say, well, let's not continue treatment, let's let the person die? Or would that only be a consequentialist type of consideration? Well, I think that it is not necessarily always going to be a consequentialist consideration for the following reason. While you have a duty not to take life and to preserve life, you also have a moral duty to meet the needs, the basic needs of your family. Normally, those two moral requirements are not going to conflict with one another. Here's a case where it appears that they do. So, what's a non-consequentialist supposed to do if there's a conflict of duties? Hierarchical reasoning, okay. In a situation like this, which duty do you think has the greater priority? The duty not to take life and to preserve life, or the duty to meet the needs of your family? And as I understand the scenario as you're portraying it, we're not saying that as a result of doing this, the family is going to lose their home, there won't be food on the table, there won't be this, that, or the other, but rather it's going to be a bit more difficult financially to take care of those needs. Well, I don't know about you, but for me, I would think the duty to preserve life has priority in this case, and I think here would be a case where the need to sacrifice would be a secondary consideration, and that goes along with the need and the requirement to meet the needs of your family. I'm not sure it's an absolutely either or. Either you take care of the loved one and don't meet the needs at all, or you take care of the needs of your own family and you let the loved one die. I think as the bills are mounting up and the finances become more and more difficult, I would want to make a point to start looking into maybe some sort of sources of public aid or whatever. And I think here's where the church can also be helpful. If we know that people are going through this kind of stress, we can, as a church, do something to help out. And I don't mean just in terms of perhaps helping meet the bills of caring for the relative, but also helping by providing meals or some perhaps daycare free of charge, so both a husband and wife can go to work and make a living. I mean, there are things that are going to be done, or that need to be done, that can be done to help out in this situation. And beyond the church, there are, of course, public resources for people in this sort of situation. And I think you would also find that if you find yourself in this situation, bills start coming from the hospital, for example. A lot of times those bills will say, if you're unable to pay in full at this time, please get in touch with us and let's see if we can work out a payment plan so that you can do this more gradually. Well, obviously over time the bills are going to mount up gigantically, so something further might need to be done to help meet the financial needs. But my point that I would want to make is I don't think it's an either-or situation. Either we take care of the relative who's in the hospital in a coma, or we meet the needs, financial needs of the family. I think you can do both. And in a case where it looks like those duties conflict, at least for me, I think the greater priority is to sustain life, especially when we're talking about the prognosis the first day. Now, let me just go back and read a part of this to you, because it went by a little bit fast, and in the midst of one of these scenarios, things are going by you very quickly, and you're emotionally overwrought. That's going to impact what you're thinking and what you're inclined to do. But class, one of the lessons that I hope that you learn from not only this test case, but from this discussion, is that somehow or other, in the midst of crises like this, you have to try to control your emotions and pay attention to everything that's being said and everything that's being done, because details do matter. Now, humanly speaking, it may not be possible for us to avoid sort of losing it and, not being able to pay attention. But obviously, there are resources available through the Lord, through the Holy Spirit. And, part of your prayer about the situation can be, Lord, you know how overwrought I am, and I need to focus on this and make wise decisions. Help me to control my emotions and to listen carefully and to be sure that I have all the relevant information that I need before I make a decision. Having said this, let me just reread this initial description. On the morning of March 29, 1986, the day before Easter, my wife Jacqueline suffered a sudden and massive stroke. Within minutes, she lapsed into a coma and was rushed to the nearest hospital, where I was told that she would almost certainly die within a few hours. Although Jackie did survive the day. Oh, so the doctors were wrong. At least initially, they said she probably isn't going to even live out the day. And she did. But the doctors say, it says, although Jackie did survive the day and several days thereafter, I was informed by her physician that she would never regain consciousness, and if she were to survive, it would be in a persistent vegetative state. Now, what is my point? My point is the doctors were wrong initially when they said she's not going to live through the rest of the day. She makes it through that day, and she makes it several more days, and by the end of those first few days, the doctors are saying, well, if she does survive, she probably will never regain consciousness, and if she does survive, she'll be in a permanent vegetative state. Well, the doctors have already been wrong about one thing in this case. They could be wrong about this. They could also be right. But what's the practical implication of that? It's probably not a good thing to make a radical decision to remove life support within the first 24 hours or 2 or 3 days or whatever. I mean, because if he'd listened to what the doctor said the first day, and then even day 3 or 4, the inclination would be to say, well, the medical technology is futile, and, you know, what's the point? If this is the prognosis, what's the point of continuing? But the doctor's prognosis was wrong the first day. So I don't know that that commits me to keeping her on technology forever or indefinitely. That's a better word. But at least it should tell me, you know, this is not an exact science, so to speak. The doctors were wrong initially. They could be wrong about this. If they're right, we'll know that, you know, a week, 2 weeks, a month, several months down the road. I don't think, just from a practical standpoint, I don't think I have to make a final decision either to indefinitely into the future keep the person on life support, or right away to remove it and let them die. So, again, as I was saying a few moments ago, it is important to listen carefully to what the doctors say, and don't be afraid to ask them questions. Okay? Now, some of them are going to be offended, but class, the days of paternalism in medicine are over. At least they better be, because the Patient Self-Determination Act passed by Congress in the latter decades of the last century says that the medical care and decisions are in your hands, not in the medical profession's hands. And if they're in my hands and I'm not the medical expert, I need to ask someone who knows the medicine. And if you're going to be offended by me asking questions, well, you know, who's the doctor next door? We are not living in a society where it's socialized medicine yet. You still can choose your physician. And I would say this not only to you in regard to something as serious as what we're talking about now, but that's true for you in terms of your basic care for your health and your family's health. If you have questions about what the doctor is telling you to do, if the doctor prescribes a medication for you and you wonder, well, what's this going to do? What are the side effects? And if there are some potential side effects that could really be problematic, what should I do to counter those? And if you ask those kind of questions and the doctor is offended, and with paternalism in medicine, the basic approach was the doctor is the all-knowing father or mother, and you just trust them and do whatever they say. Don't ask any questions. Don't make any suggestions. Just leave it in their hands. As I say, if that's people's, doctors' attitudes, they need an attitude shift. And not just because of the Patient Self-Determination Act, but because your health is too important, your family's health is too important to be held captive by a doctor who's offended if you ask a question. As I say, if they're offended, find another doctor. You're not forced to use that one. And there are, thankfully, a lot of doctors who are not offended. They're happy not only to answer your questions, they are also happy to listen to your requests and any suggestions, and sometimes they take your suggestions. And if you don't have that kind of doctor, I would encourage you to hunt one up that does. Now, don't sacrifice medical competence for the sake of someone who'll let me ask question. But thankfully, there are really competent doctors who are not offended when you ask question. Okay, so basically what we're saying is, at least initially, it would be hard as a non-consequentialist to morally justify removing the life support systems this early in the going. Let me read you the next paragraph. The author says, on the 41st day of her coma. Oh, so the doctors were even further wrong. They said she wouldn't live through the day that she had the stroke, and now he's saying day 41, on the 41st day of her coma, which he said was May 9th, convinced that Jackie could not recover from her stroke, I petitioned the court for permission to disconnect her life support system. The permission was denied. Now, let me ask you about two different things, and let's take these one at a time. Do you think that this fellow, this husband, ethically had a right, morally was doing right by petitioning to have her life support removed? And if you think no, why? If you think yes, why?
Really, before answering that question, one thing that came to mind is there, in your research of ethics in the medical realm and this issue, is there some discussion of medical excessiveness? In other words, is there a basic level of preserving life that is morally we're obligated to, and then beyond that, though, it's permissible but not required? In other words, is there a certain level of sustaining life that we would expect to...
Okay, great question. The question is there within medical ethics a basic consensus on how much care is obligatory, and at what point is it unnecessary to continue, and it's just too much? The answer is no, there is no consensus on that, and part of the reason is the people engaging in the discussion don't come from the same ethical theories. If you're a consequentialist, you might think that he should have removed this the first day. If you're a non-consequentialist of, let's say you hold some sort of divine command theory, you're probably going to say absolutely not. Well, what about day 41? Well, if you're a consequentialist, you're probably looking at the bills. You're noticing that while she's not gotten worse, she hasn't gotten any better. And you're thinking, what's the point? And so on a consequentialist account of ethics, you could make a very strong case that not only is it prudent to remove life support, but it is morally obligatory to do so. What if you're a non-consequentialist? Is it morally right for this man to have petitioned the court to remove the life support? Yes.
If she meets all the criteria of death except for the spontaneous breathing, I guess my question would be, if she meets all the other criteria for death except for the spontaneous breathing, would removing at least the breathing apparatus to determine whether or not she meets that criteria as well be a factor?
Yeah, the question is, if she meets 3 of the 4 criteria of physical death, but the one that really in this case we don't know whether she meets it or not because she's on this respirator, do we then remove the respirator to see if criterion 4 is met. Well, um, that in a way is sort of stacking the deck, if I can put it this way, against life, because you know that with the respirator, she is breathing, and life is being maintained, and you are pretty sure medically if you remove that, she's going to stop breathing on her own. Maybe she'll be another Karen Ann Quinlan, but we don't know that. But you have to make the case for the morality of doing one thing or another based on the conditions right now, not based on what I would find out if I manipulated the situation. So that's why I'm saying I think it's somewhat stacking the deck. In other words, you're trying to manipulate the situation so that you have all four criteria of death. Now, I mean, look at it this way. Suppose that there is brain activity, but you don't know about spontaneous breathing and the other two criteria she doesn't meet. Well, in order to be considered dead, she has to meet all four of those criteria. And it seems to me that if there is some brain activity, and it's likely if I remove the respirator, she would die, well, then I shouldn't remove the respirator, because doing so would kill her. You see, if she's really dead now, removing it isn't going to kill her. She's already dead. So you can always manipulate a situation so that the person is dead, and then you look for the criteria. But we're asked to make the judgment given the circumstances as they are. So good question. That is an important issue. Yes?
I would say that as a non-consequentialist, if you've determined that she's a living person still, then the passage of time doesn't make that person any less a person than they were on day one.
Okay.
So that would be my reasoning for keeping that person on life support.
Okay, very, very good. What our brother is suggesting is that the duty not to take a life and to preserve a life, yeah, those are duties, but there's another one that we haven't yet mentioned, and until now, you have mentioned it, that this is a person. Now, obviously, this is going to stem not from a sociological developmental concept of personhood, but it's going to stem from a more biological genetic view of personhood that focuses on the image of God. And if you're wondering if this is still a human person, well, you can do a DNA test and see that, yeah, this individual has the configuration of a human being. So on the one hand, this suggests we can't say, let's disconnect the machinery because this is no longer a person. State of consciousness, we're saying, is not the way you determine whether someone is a person or not, unless you hold the sociological developmental idea of personhood. But that's not a view that is going to fit with a divine command theory that says we're not to take innocent life. And someone is innocent life if they're in a coma or if they're conscious or whatever. And then, well, do they qualify as a human person? Yes, on the basis of the notion of personhood we presented yesterday. And so when we say we're not to take the innocent life of a human person, we wanted to stretch out our explanation of what thou shalt not kill means, that's part of it. Well, then, yeah, you shouldn't. You shouldn't. Yeah, for me, yes, 41 days into it, I would be, I'm sure, beginning to lose a lot of hope, but I don't see how that would give me the right to petition the court to do this. What if it were 4 years down the road and there's been no change? Would that make a difference?
They're still a person.
Okay. Okay. Obviously, there's going to be greater pressure, right, from the medical profession and from your family members, perhaps, who don't share your ethical stance, or you haven't discussed this with them. But the basic ethical rule is not that you don't have a right to take the life of an innocent person within the first X number of days of being in a coma, but after that, it's okay. No, that's not what the rule says. So, as hard as it might be to continue this, I think it would be hard to make a case that someone working, especially with a biblically based ethic, would be morally allowed to do what the husband is asking the court to let him do.
It seems to me that in a non-consequentialist approach, there would be no place where you would take the life support off unless it wasn't really doing anything, in which case it's irrelevant.
Yes. Let me expand on that. First of all, repeat it. The comment is, it seems that with a non-consequentialist approach to ethics, there would be no amount of time that would allow you to remove the life support unless there was...
Well, unless it wasn't doing any good.
Unless it wasn't doing good, right.
It's irrelevant.
Okay.
In other words, my thought is, really the only, at that point, the question is, do we do something, if you have a procedure that maybe could help her beyond where she's at, then maybe you have questions of, do we go ahead and do something actively?
Well, again, let me repeat and then respond to it. What was said is you seem to be obligated, one seems to be obligated with a non-consequentialist ethic to continue this indefinitely unless you find out that it's not doing any good or there's something that you could do to make her better or whatever. Well, I would say, first of all, if it's not doing her any good, the question is, how are we going to know that in this case? And what qualifies as doing her good? If the only thing that will qualify as doing her good is healing her, then no, it's not doing her any good. If what qualifies as doing her good is helping her to breathe, then yes, it is fulfilling the intent for which it was put in place, and it is doing her good. And for me to say, I don't know whether it's doing her any good, either means that I'm expecting it to cure her, or I'm not sure whether she actually needs this. But unless the doctor says to you, I'm sure that if you removed it, she'd breathe on her own, how can you know that it's not doing her any good, that it's not helping her to breathe? I think the other thing that would allow you to do something is if, while on the machinery, her condition does get worse. See, in this case, she doesn't get better, but she hasn't gotten any worse either. If she starts to get worse, where there are some medical indications that death is only within an hour or two or whatever it is, and the doctor can give you some substantial evidence that that's so, then I think making a decision to remove the technology could possibly be morally justified. Not because the technology isn't doing her any good. It is doing what it's supposed to be. It's just that some other things have happened and are happening in her body that are going to take her life very quickly, regardless of whether this respirator continues in place or not. But it's hard to know that the machinery is not doing any good, especially when its intended purpose is not to cure, but to maintain the life. So, now someone might say, and I have had students who have said, hearing that kind of response, that you could, one could conceive of being able to make, excuse me, a case in that circumstance where there's a change in her condition and the doctor can point to some factors that say she's going to die in a few hours. You could envision making a case that it would be morally permissible to remove the technology. Sometimes students have said, and I think their point is correct, well, but if she's really going to die in only another 2 or 3 hours, well, what's the harm in leaving the technology? If it's not going to keep her, if it's not going to kill her by maintaining it, and it might make her a little bit more comfortable over the last 2 or 3 hours of her life, then why remove it? And I have to say, you know, that makes sense as well. All that I'm saying is, if you came to the conclusion that we are going to remove the technology, I think you could make a case that you're morally permitted to do so. I don't think you're morally obligated to do so. There's no rule that I can think of that says you must remove technology in circumstances X, Y, and Z. But on the other hand, if you say, well, if she really is going to die in another few hours, what's the harm in leaving it? Well, I don't think you failed on any obligation by doing that, and I think you are morally allowed to do that as well. So I think my inclination, having thought about what various folk have said, is, well, on the chance that the doctor's wrong about her dying within 2 or 3 hours, or even if he's right, it's not going to hurt her by leaving it. If I'm going to make a mistake, let's err on the side of life, and so let's leave it. And if it turns out the doctor's right, she will die on the machine 3 hours down the road. And if he's wrong, she won't, and this will help to keep her comfortable. Okay, well, so we think from our ethical theory, it probably would not have been morally acceptable to either remove this technology or to petition the court. Now, it says that the permission was denied by the court. Remember, this is written in 1988, and it happened in 1986. Things were a good bit different then as opposed to now. There have, in the intervening years, been some significant court cases. They're detailed for you in the chapter in abortion and euthanasia that have, so in some people's mind, established a right, a patient's right to die. And as a result, it's not unusual when someone is in this condition to petition to request to remove it. But now, given the way the laws are written and the court cases that have set precedents, if this were to happen in 2012, and you know, same basic scenario, why would this man even have to petition the court? I want to be sure that you understand why that's so. Back then, it's clear why he would have to petition the court. It hadn't yet been established clearly that there was this right to die. And so if you messed around with this technology, you or your physicians possibly could face prosecution. But that's not the case now. So now would you have to go to court or wouldn't you, and why? Yeah.
She had an advance directive that she didn't want to be taken off life support.
Okay. The response is you might now have to go to court because the person had signed an advance directive saying she didn't want to be taken off life support. Good. If she had signed an advance directive saying that if she were in this condition, she did want the technology to be removed, unless her family disagreed, there's no need to go to court, because the courts have already established that that can be done. What we're talking about here, class, is voluntary euthanasia. So why would someone today, other than if you disagreed with a directive, why would someone today need to go to court? Exactly. You'd have to go to court today if there were no directive. And that's precisely what happened in the Nancy Cruzan and the Terry Schiavo cases. That's why they went on forever. There was no living will, no form of advance directive that had ever been signed, and it wasn't clear that there were various people who had been told by her clearly, I don't want to be left in situation X, Y, and Z, pull the plug, so you go to the court. Well, now, the court denied the permission. At that point, in 86, it might have denied it because it looked at doing this as taking of innocent life. If the court today denied it, it would be because the person who was the patient had not expressed their wishes about this. In fact, as I say, that's exactly what happened with Nancy Cruzan and Terry Schiavo. And in the Nancy Cruzan case, they petitioned several times, and it was rejected on this ground. And eventually what they did is they gathered together enough anecdotal information from conversations that Nancy Cruzan had had with various people. They were able to come back to the court and convince the judge on the basis of this kind of evidence that she really would not want to have been kept alive in this condition. And on that basis, not on the basis that it's okay to take innocent life, but on the basis that this is your decision, and when we know what your decision is, even if morally we think it's wrong to take innocent life, free will, freedom of choice trumps sanctity of life. And so the court gave permission, and in Nancy Cruzan's case, they stopped feeding her through a feeding tube, and over a period of a couple of weeks or so, she died. Similar thing with Terry Schiavo. So, you know, we might read this and say, terrific, good for that court. That judge must have been pro-life. Not necessarily at all. The way the laws are written on these things are complicated enough that you could have a pro-euthanasia doctor block a request to remove life support or feeding tubes or anything else. Not because he's against euthanasia, but because the law says you have to know that this is what the patient wishes. Okay, so let me take one more comment or question, and then let me read to you the final act of this story, if I may. Yes, brother. Yes.
In American law, does it not, with freedom of choice, does it not make any difference if it's the spouse? Can they not make a decision if there's no living will? Does it matter that it's the husband?
Okay, good question. In American law, if there isn't any living will, does it matter who's making the decision? Not necessarily. Now that means maybe yes, maybe no. If the crucial issue is still, do you have the evidence that this is what your relative would have wanted to do? And what's more important is that you have the evidence than that you're her blood relative. The fact that you're her husband doesn't give you any more right to kill her, to take her life, than someone who's not a family member. Now, yes, it does in a certain sense, because I'm thinking of the Terry Schiavo case. You remember one of the maneuvers that the Schiavo family or the Schindler family took, because Terry's husband, Schiavo, was the one who was pushing for stopping the feeding, and because he was her husband, they gave precedence to the evidence that he presented and the wishes that he had. And of course, that was contrary to the wishes of the Schindler family, so that at a certain point in the case, the family petitioned the court to divorce Terry's husband. To what end? So that then precedence, or preference I should say, would go to the family of Terry, but that still wouldn't mean the case was totally closed, because if someone who's not a family member can come up with clear evidence that she wouldn't want to be in this situation, there still is a good chance that the judge will say, stop the feeding. So it's a tricky thing. Sometimes it does matter and sometimes it doesn't. But what is paramount is that voluntary euthanasia in the United States is allowable by law, by court precedent. You don't normally hear that, but that's what it amounts to. If someone has said, I don't want to be kept alive in this situation, then you have to follow their wishes. That's not non-voluntary. Non-voluntary is when they are not able to express their wishes and you kill them anyway. Involuntary is when they do express their wishes and say, I don't want to be killed, but you kill them anyway. Voluntary is where they express their wishes, say they want to be killed, and you do take their life. And regardless of what we think about the morality of voluntary euthanasia, it is the law in the U.S. that you can, given the right circumstances, do voluntary euthanasia. Interestingly enough, in most states, if this woman had written into an advance directive that if I ever get in this situation, I'd like you to send me to Jack Kevorkian or one of his ilk and, hook me up to the suicide machine, that would have been interesting to see what would have happened, because if that's her last wishes, you should have to honor those. And yet, if you were to send her to some state other than Washington or Oregon, it's not clear that to perform this in that state would be in accord with the law, but it's not clear that it would be against the law given the Patient Self-Determination Act and if you've signed an advance directive. It does get complicated. But that's one of the reasons we are discussing these things this week, because I want you to understand what the law is, and as well as the morality. And sometimes the law goes against morality, and the law ties our hands, so there's not a whole lot that we can do other than trying to talk with the people who are making the decisions and see if we can't get them to come around to our point of view. Well, as I say, there's one more paragraph. Where we left it was on day 41 when he went to petition the court to remove life support and the court said no. Next paragraph, on May 15, 6 days after my appearance in court, I came to Jackie's hospital room for a last visit before transferring her to a long-term nursing care facility. I looked at her lying in the bed and saw Jacqueline open her eyes and look back at me. It was the 47th day of her coma. Today, almost 2 years later, after many long hours of therapy, she is well on her way toward a full recovery from her illness. Now, class, this is not the normal thing that happens in that kind of case. But the fact that there can be this sort of exception should caution us about, if I can put it this way, pulling the trigger too quickly. Surely day one is too early, especially when they say she won't even live out the day and she lives several days. Beyond that, I would be very, very hesitant. Now, I don't think that you and I have a right to expect, if we have a relative in this condition, or if we should ever get in this condition, I don't think we have a right to expect that God is going to do this for us. But I do think we need to be cautious and at least give enough time and say, well, what's enough time? I don't know that we can tell you what enough time is in any specific case in advance of actually getting into the situation. Maybe it's a month. Maybe it's a year. Maybe it's several years. I don't know. The answer to that is partially dependent on the medical details of the case. It's not exclusively dependent on the morality of the case. And it may also be in part dependent on the law and what it will allow you to do and when it will allow you to do it. Well, good. This, as I say, is an exception, but it is a reminder that these things are not always as clear-cut as they may seem. If this had gone on for 4 years, would we then have a right in these circumstances to remove this? Well, probably not a legal right, because it sounds like she had never signed any kind of advance directive. Morally, I don't see that the issues change over time. I think that part of the reason people start panicking is not just the finances of this, and they hate the emotional strain on them, but there's this fear that we talked about at least yesterday, if not also the day before, that if we keep this person on the machine, he or she cannot die. And the longer it goes and they haven't died, that's the evidence and the argument that that assumption is right. But the assumption is wrong. You can die on a machine. And sometimes when the doctor says you can't continue to live unless you're on a machine, that's also wrong. Karen Ann Quinlan shows that. Medicine is not an exact science. And please, I have great appreciation for the medical profession, medical science. I'm not trying in any way to denigrate what they can do. And I think that it is an incredible blessing that the Lord has allowed us to live at this time in history when all of the medical procedures and knowledge and medications and surgeries are available, that are available. You know, if we'd lived at a much different time in history, life expectancy would have been such that many of us would already have been dead, if not for what medicine can do. So I think we need to thank the Lord for living at such a time. But that doesn't mean that medicine is infallible and that it can do everything. Well, I had promised you I wanted to share with you some practical things, and let me turn to those. And let me just get started with one thing, and then let's take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about some other. Before this morning is over, I want to turn to the homosexuality material and look at what has been proved and what hasn't been proved scientifically about genetics and homosexuality and so on and so forth. But let me turn to this other. First of all, a question oftentimes arises. Nowadays, it's a little bit different than it was at one point. But the question is it morally permissible to sign a living will? Is it morally obligatory to do so? Nowadays, the question is, why in the world haven't you signed a living will? Do you realize the chances you're taking? Well, what about that? What about that? I want to be sure that you're aware of what a living will is and what it does and what the alternatives are. And let me just say up front that I think it is unwise and to a certain degree irresponsible. Notice I haven't said immoral, but unwise and to a certain extent probably irresponsible not to have executed some sort of advance directive. And that's true for everyone in this room, regardless of your age. With what you've heard about the law and this case and the strong bias toward death and being able to control the time and the manner of your death, it's wise not to leave it up to the medical profession or just hope everything will turn out okay. Or, you know, I don't need to do any of these things. When it's my time, God will just take me like that. Well, maybe so, but that's not a guarantee. In my family, I was the youngest of 3 children. So there were 5 members of our family. 3 of those members are with the Lord, and in all 3 cases there were end-of-life issues. Some more, stringent, more immediate that had to be dealt with than in other cases. But in none of those cases did the family member was the family member in perfect health and then bang, they died all at once. And with what is known medically and what can be done, it's not impossible that someone can die in their sleep or die on the spot, but it's getting more and more likely that your death will happen over a period of time than that it will, you'll be in great health and then bang, you'll be gone. So, what is a living will? A living will is an instrument in which you try to say, or you do say, according to this instrument, that if at some time you are in a certain kind of physical, medical condition, you do not want to be kept alive on medical technology. Now, In principle, that may sound pretty good because I think we can all envision scenarios where even with a pro-life ethic and being a non-consequentialist, we are not entirely sure that you'd be obligated to continue life on and on and on forever and ever. Amen. But there are some things you need to know about the living will. And the first thing is probably not as important as the next things, but it's worth noting. Every state in the Union, in the U.S., every state has its own form of living will. So if you're going to execute one of these, you do it in the state where you live. Now, the wording is not necessarily dramatically different from one state to the next, but each state has its own form. So if you live in California, you'd want to get a copy of the California Living Will. Another state, you'd have to get a copy of that one. And if you are wondering where could I see what one of these things look like, well, you can find them online. I mean, Google Living Will Forms or Living Will Advance Directive, and you'll have all sorts of options that you can click on, and you can see examples of living wills. One thing I will forewarn you of, in some of the websites that'll come up if you Google this, you'll have to pay to actually see the form, but there are some where you're not going to have to pay anything, either to see it or even, I think, to print it out or download it and print it out. Okay, so that's point one. Point two, however, is, and this is significant, I think the general conception of most people in our culture today, perhaps even many or most of you, is that if you sign a living will, you have to either sign it as it's stated or not sign it at all. You can't make any changes in it. That is wrong. Not true. That's the impression you're going to get if you go to a lawyer and ask him to help you make a living will, because it's going to save him a little bit of work. But technically, in one of these documents, you can have it say whatever you want it to say. And that means that you can add things to it that you don't want to be done or you do want to be done. And you can strike things from the document that you don't like. So don't allow yourself or your family member to get buffaloed into a corner where you are basically told, here's the document, either sign it as is or don't. No, those are not the only options. Well, okay, is it morally acceptable to sign one of these documents? Well, if the document contains something that commits you to saying, yes, I want voluntary euthanasia, and you think voluntary euthanasia is immoral, then I think it would not be morally acceptable for you to sign that document. But if the document does not commit you to anything that against which you would have a moral objection, then I think it would be and could be, well, probably should say it in the other order, could and would be morally permissible for you to sign that. Having said that, I would advise you not to, because there's a better way to get this done. What's the problem with a living will? And what I'm going to say to you is not a moral objection. You already know what the moral objections would be because I just mentioned them a few moments ago. There are some practical considerations. The way a living will is written it gives permission to medical personnel to do what you've said can be done, or not do what you've said cannot be done. Which means what? It means that when the crisis comes, the decision-making power is in the hands of the doctors, the nurses, the hospital, not in your hands or your family. Oh yeah, they will consult your husband, your wife, your mother, father, family. They'll consult, but not necessarily. I mean, if there's a crisis situation and you've got to do something or the person will die, you may not be able to get in touch with the family. And the doctors, the hospital does have the authority, if you have a living will, to do what it deems best. And thankfully, at least at this stage in our nation's history, the basic presumption in medicine is still, when there's a medical crisis, at first let's try to see what we can do to preserve life. Their initial intuition is not, let's see how we can get rid of this person. But for some of these folk, if they preserve life initially and it goes on for several days and there's not much improvement, well, then their prejudice may go in the other direction in favor of removing. Well, you may say, well, that's okay, but if I give this permission by a living will to my physician, my doctors, and I've talked with them, etc., etc., well, isn't that okay? Well, in principle, it sounds good, but how can you guarantee that when a crisis comes, you're going to be in town and your doctor is too? Some of us have traveled a good distance to get here this week. Some of you way longer distances than others of us, and I definitely want to thank you for making that effort. But there's no guarantee that just because you're out of town, you're exempt from having some sort of episode, needing to use a hospital. And even if you were in town, there's no guarantee that your doctor wouldn't be on vacation or out of town on a business trip or whatever. So that if you say, well, I'll sign this because my doctors are pro-life, so that when it has to be used, I've got someone who's pro-life who's going to execute it, you're kidding yourself. The chances that everything will come together perfectly like that are not zero, but they're not good enough to take this kind of risk. The other thing about this that causes great concern to me, and it's not just practical, but it is moral. I have read a living will, at least the start of a living will, in the state of Illinois. Let me share with you what happened. Some years ago, my brother went into the hospital. This was in February of 2004. He had fallen and broken his hip, and he needed an operation. My brother had never executed any kind of advance directive. And here's a heads up for all of you. If you want to get an operation, in fact, if you want to even get some tests done at a hospital, especially if they're tests in which you might be unconscious because of anesthetic, you will not be allowed to get that care without having signed some sort of advance directive. Why? Because something could happen in the midst of a simple procedure like a colonoscopy, where you go into cardiac arrest, and if the hospital doesn't have a living will or some kind of advance directive, they're probably going to err on the side of life, but still be fearful that they will be sued. People have been known to sue hospitals and doctors for malpractice. But if you have a living will on record, then that removes possibility of litigation because you've already given permission to the staff to do their thing. So my brother had never signed anything, and so he had to sign something, and they gave him a copy of the Illinois Living Will, and wouldn't have done the operation without that being there. Well, the operation went well, but he had diabetes and heart problems, kidney problems as complications from diabetes. So basically immediately after the surgery, he went into intensive care, and over a period of a few days, he'd get a bit better. They'd move him to a regular room for rehab, and then before it really got started, he'd be back in intensive care, and this went on for a while. And one of the days, about a week and a half after he had gone in for the operation, he had a really bad day. He had a defibrillator that had been inserted, I think, a year and a half before. It had never gone off. It went off something like 6 or 7 times that same day, which I gather means if not for the defibrillator, you would have had a heart attack. Well, we began to see he was in bad shape. And on this day, we were called over to the hospital. And one of the things that startled me, I was told, you know, there's a DNR note in your brother's chart. DNR means do not resuscitate. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how that got there and who put it there. In other words, what that meant is if during the night or during the day he should stop breathing, DNR means you don't have to try to resuscitate him. You just let him die. And the doctor who was working on the case at that time had told the family, you know, the situation is not good. We're not sure he's going to live through the night, and you might really want to consider not using any sort of technology and let nature take its course. Well, we weren't interested in doing that. But my sister-in-law told me about the fact that he hadn't signed any kind of advance directive, and they had made him sign a living will. And I was interested in seeing what it said. I wanted to see whether it said something about a DNR order. At this moment, as you could imagine, things were quite emotion-packed, and I didn't want to start an argument with my sister-in-law over the wisdom of DNR. But thankfully, in the midst of conversation, it somehow came up. I think she offered that she had not been the person to put the DNR in the chart. It was done by the doctor. I don't think the doctor had even asked whether to put it there. And I said, well, do you want this? No. I said, well, then let's see that it gets taken out. So I went and I asked some of the personnel, I said, the family's uncomfortable with this, can we take it out? Well, you've got to get the approval of the doctor who put it. I said, where is he? Can I talk with him? Oh, he's already gone home. I said, can we call him? I want to talk with him. So somewhat reluctantly they did, and I talked with him, and he initially wasn't very amenable to this. He explained the gravity of the case, and I said, I understand that. I said, but the family really is not comfortable with a DNR. We did not give permission. It was put in the chart, and that's not what the family wants. Well, in the goodness of the Lord, the doctor said this. He said, well, let me say this. Let's remove it for tonight. And could you come tomorrow morning about 10 a.m. and we can talk about this with your brother and his wife, and we'll make a decision of whether to put it back on then. I thought, you know, that's a good compromise, and I had some ideas of what I would do. In the meantime, I said, sure, that's a good solution. My main concern was, at that point, with what I knew about his physical condition, if there was a DNR in the medical record, it would not be unlikely that he might stop breathing during that very night, and a DNR would say, don't resuscitate. So he would die that evening. So I thought, all right, if that's removed, at least I can go home and the rest of the family can, and we can get a night of sleep and come back. But in the midst of this, I had talked with my sister-in-law and I found out that my brother had signed a living will, and I said, do you have a copy of that? I'd like to see what it says. And she said, well, it's in his briefcase, but that's out in the car. And I said, could I see it? And so one family member went out and got it, brought it in, and I read the first sentence and I hit the ceiling. Here's what it said. This is not verbatim, but this is the substance of it. It says, in the case that there should be a major event, major medical event, which would be like a stroke or heart attack or something of that sort, in the event that there should be this kind of event, and it is not clear that I would survive, or it appears that I would not survive, I do not want to be placed on any life support system. I thought, okay, now let's see the next sentence. I looked through the rest of the paragraph, nothing else. And I hit the ceiling. Why? This says if there is a major event and it is fairly clear that I'm going to die, I don't want the technology. But what if there's a major event and it's not clear that I'll die? Then what are you supposed to do? Nothing is said in the document at all. But having given permission not to use the technology if you think, if there is a serious event and you think probably won't survive, what do you think is going to be the most likely thing they would do with a major event and they're not sure? Not use the technology. You've got to read the document and see what it says and see what it doesn't say. So what did we do? Well, here's what I did, and here's what I would suggest to you. There is a better way than a living will. It's called a durable power of attorney. And there is a durable power of attorney for medical decisions, and there is another document that's a durable power of attorney for business matters. Back in 1995, as my wife's condition was getting progressively worse, I was getting very concerned about a number of things, not least of which was I could see that her ability to make significant decisions, take care of one thing and another financially was just going away and had pretty much gone. And my fear was, sure, I didn't want her to have no recourse, but what I was most afraid of was what will happen to my wife and my children if I should have a heart attack and die, or if I should have a heart attack and be incapacitated. Who would have a right to take care not only of me, but more to the point, my wife and family? No one. So I thought, we better go and see a lawyer, an estate lawyer. and talk with him about this. And we did, and I'll share some more of things that I learned, once we come back from a break. But he had me fill out, he didn't even suggest living will. He had me fill out, and my wife fill out, a durable power of attorney. Now, what does that do? Well, several things. In a durable power of attorney, you state, and you can state it as extensively as you want or as briefly as you want. You can state exactly what you would or would not like to have done in any situation that might arise. There's no way you can anticipate every situation. So you're going to have to say something fairly general. The one that I did because of my studies in ethics, it's probably more detailed and extensive than most of them would be. But that's okay. You still can't forecast every possible scenario. You're probably thinking, how is this any better than a living will? Well, first of all, there cannot be any question about can you word it however you want. Yes, you put whatever you want. But here's the advantage. A durable power of attorney document allows you to name the person who will make the decisions if you're incapacitated. And just in case that person is not available, you can name a second person who will make the decisions. And guess what? You get to choose who the persons are who have the durable power of attorney. So it meant that my wife's document gives me durable power of attorney for medical decisions, and then we stated some things that we wouldn't want done or that we would. And then if I should not be able to, well, if you can't contact me or I'm not able to serve, then we have the next person in line. And since it's the person of your choosing, make sure that you get people that you want. But then, class, here's a crucial thing. Then you've got to sit down and talk to them and tell them what you would want and what you don't want. And here you do have to get fairly specific. And if they disagree with you, now's the time to find it out before you give them durable power of attorney, so that you can get someone else who does agree. I mean, you've got to be sure that they're going to carry out your wishes. What's the advantage of this? Legally, the doctors, the hospital are not supposed to do anything to you unless they have permission of the person who has durable power of attorney. So, in contrast to the living will, you're not giving away decision-making power to the hospitals and the doctors, whoever happen to be on duty or on call. It has to be someone that you designate. Well, what if they're out of town or out of the country? They've got to try to contact you, and if they can't, well, then you've named a second person. But you do have to sit down and talk with them about what you want and what you don't want, and it wouldn't hurt to tell them the ethical basis for what you're saying and make sure that in good conscience they can do what you're asking them to do or not do what you're asking them not to do because they agree with your ethical stance, etc., etc. The time to have these kinds of discussions is not in the midst of a crisis, it's beforehand. But a durable power of attorney will accomplish everything that a living will does, every good thing, but it does something that a living will won't. It gives decision-making power to someone that you trust, so there's some control. Now, there's still going to be times when maybe they think, oh, well, we know what needs to be done, so we'll just do it. And technically, they need to ask you, person who has durable power of attorney. Now, I find, for example, at the nursing home, there are some times when there's something that they're planning to do with my wife or whatever that I don't like, and the doctor that works for the nursing home has said, no, we're going to do this, and I have to remind them, folks, I've given you a copy of the durable power of attorney. Legally, you are required to get permission from me before you do this. Now, they know that if they do something that I don't want, I'm not just looking for an opportunity to file a lawsuit. And I don't like to start saber rattling to make sure that I'm heard, but occasionally you have to do that. But that's the advantage of a durable power of attorney. With a living will, there couldn't be any legal basis for challenge. And class, of course, the issue is not we're looking for a chance to sue a doctor or a hospital to get money. I don't care about that. I care about my wife being cared for properly. That's the issue. It's not I see potential dollar signs and I'm going to set myself up so that I can get that money. No, it's I care about my wife and her needs, and I want to make sure, insofar as I can, that they are properly taken care of. And I want to be involved in that process, and I want some sort of guarantees that I will be involved. And that's what it's all about. Not interested in bankrupting a nursing home or a doctor, but there are issues of common sense. So, would it be immoral to sign a living will? Well, with what you've heard, I think you should look very carefully at what it says and make sure you agree with it from a moral standpoint. If you do, I don't think you'd be immoral if you signed it, but I do think there's a wiser way to go, and it's durable power of attorney. And you also, in terms of your parents, aging parents, you want a durable power of attorney for business, because without that, if they're not able to pay their bills because they're just having trouble writing checks, I'm not talking about their financial resources aren't there, they just can't mentally process this, and the creditors are hounding them, but you don't have durable power of attorney for business, you can't step in and write the checks off of their account or any other way. You can't make the business decisions. So that's why you want this, so that you can make sure that their needs are cared for, the mortgage is paid, the various bills are taken care of, and they don't have to worry about that stuff because they have designated you or whoever to take care of that stuff for them. So this is something that is important, class. I mean, I know that I don't have to convince any of you that that all of us have responsibilities to care for the needs of our family. What I want to underscore is that involves caring for the needs of the family at the other end of life when they can't care for themselves. And the idea that, well, we're not going to need that because the Lord's going to return and the rapture will happen and we'll be gone. I hope so. But, we need to be wise. There are no guarantees. You know that. That's why you are in ministry, and you do have some long-range plans that go beyond, the end of today, even though you believe, as I do, that the Lord can return today. Well, apply that to this aspect of life as well. And as pastors, I think it is wise to make sure that the families in your congregation know some of this information and you help them. And you need to have these conversations with people, and they need to have these conversations about end-of-life issues with their family. It's not going to be the most fun conversation you've ever had. But you know what? If you bring up the issue, you could have on a Sunday, have it be a Sunday where you talk about end-of-life issues, and after the service, have a luncheon. There was a church that did this in our area. I participated in it, where you then have some people, let's say if they're specialists in ethics, et cetera, there's someone who's a good Christian lawyer who knows elder law. Bring them in, explain to people what advance directives are, explain which ones you think would be best, and encourage them to make these things out. It's not going to be the most fun thing you'll do as a pastor or that they will do as a parishioner, but it needs to be faced. And you know what's probably going to happen as well? You may find that there are people in your church who will come and talk with you about this, and in the process of that, they will share with you their fears about dying, and they're great Christians, and they know where they're going. But they will share with you fears about this, that, or the other. What's my family members going to think? There's a possible problem. You may be able to minister in their lives in ways that you never would even know about if you never broached this topic. And if we're going to be good shepherds, good under-shepherds of the flock that God has given to us, I think that means recognizing that there are needs at various times of life, including this time at the end. And to simply say, let's not think about it, let's trust the Lord that everything will turn out, well, given the technology today and the ability to extend physical life a lot longer than there's ability to interact with the environment, it's more likely than not that all of us are going to have to face one of these end-of-life scenarios, at least with one or more members of your family. So rather than denying that and hoping everything will come out okay, confront it, talk to your people, have them have those conversations with their family. As I say, the time for these conversations is not in the middle of a crisis, because everything is going to be emotionally difficult. It's going to be hard to think rationally about anything. If you've had these conversations, taken care of some of these things beforehand, it's still going to be emotionally overwhelming when the crisis comes, but at least you've got some strategies and some ideas of what would be appropriate to do and what wouldn't be. To finish off the story about my brother, and then I must let us take a break. When I heard what the doctor said, I agreed, not only because I thought it was a good compromise that let us do what I wanted to do at least that night, but I decided, you know, I have my wife's durable power of attorney and mine. I'm going to go home and I'm going to write up another one with the same wording, except I'm going to put in my brother's name and his wife, and then the third person, their daughter. And what I'm going to do, the doctor said we'd meet at 10 o'clock. I'm going to get up earlier. I'm going to get there by 9 a.m., and I'm going to show this document to my sister-in-law and explain it to her and see if she is comfortable with it, and see if we can get my brother to sign it. And then it will already be a fait accompli before the doctor arrives. There still might be an argument, but there isn't going to be much he can do about it. So I did that. I came the next morning, my wife and I went over, and I showed the document to my sister-in-law, explained it, and she was pleased with it. The point that I emphasized is this puts the decision-making power in the hands of the person it should be in, namely you. And my brother's family. So she said, well, should we go over and show this to Paul? I said, sure, let's go ahead. And so we did. I started to explain a little bit. He looked at it. He was somewhat out of it, and physically, and was having a little bit trouble focusing. At a certain point, he just looked up at his wife and he said, are you comfortable with this? She said, yes. He said, okay. He signed it. We waited about another half an hour or so, and the doctor came in, and I thought, well, I think what I'm going to do, I never met this doctor. I talked with him on the phone. But I'm going to greet him warmly and take a positive approach and hope that this turns out well. So he comes in to the room, and I get up and I said, Doctor, so great to meet you. Thanks so much for coming and for being willing to do what you did last night. And actually, before you came, we've drafted, I went home and drafted a durable power of attorney for medical, and I brought it in and showed it to my sister-in-law and my brother, and they were pleased with it, and they signed it. And so there's really no need to have this conversation. And I wasn't sure what I was going to have as a response. And you know what? In the goodness of the Lord, here was his response. Well, okay, thanks. Have a good day. And he left. Sometimes, by being proactive and being positive, you can avoid a nasty argument. I mean, the Lord is working in the situation to help you do what's right to do. And I wish I could tell you that my brother is still alive. He didn't come home from the hospital. He did die about a week or so later, but at least that issue of what's going to be in his chart and what are they allowed to do, we didn't have to, as a family, worry about that.